Calder-Voss didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed open the door of Rookbar Ranch's main house like he already owned it, letting the cold morning air flood the room, and dropped a folded contract on the table in front of Elias Rook without so much as a greeting. Then he looked at Merritt, standing at the stove with a ladle in her hand, and said, "You, get out. Men are talking." She didn't move right away, just looked at him. "I said get out, cook." That word landed the way he meant it to, like a door slamming in her face. If you've ever been dismissed before you were even given a chance to speak, you know exactly what that moment feels like. This is the story of a woman who was told to leave the room, and ended up being the only reason anyone in it survived the winter. Stay with us to the end, because this one will stay with you. And if you're watching from somewhere out in the world, drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Subscribe if you haven't yet. You won't want to miss what comes next. The morning Merritt Veil walked up the dirt road to Rookbar Ranch. She had 11 cents, a canvas bag with a broken strap, and a hunger that had stopped feeling urgent 2 days ago and started feeling like just another permanent condition of her life. She wasn't sure what was worse, the hunger itself or the way she'd gotten used to it. The ranch appeared through the pines like something that had been grand once and then forgot to keep trying. The main house needed paint. One of the fence posts along the eastern pasture leaned at a tired angle, held in place more by habit than by anything solid. A barn sat to the left with a door that didn't close all the way, and from somewhere inside it came the low, uncertain sound of cattle that hadn't been fed on schedule. Merritt noticed all of this before she reached the front steps. She knocked on the door frame rather than the door, because the door was already open, and there was a man sitting just inside at a table covered in papers. He was perhaps 50, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something more honest than handsome. Deep lines, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days, and eyes that were currently staring at the papers in front of him the way a man stares at something he no longer has the energy to argue with. "Mr. Rook," she said. He looked up, took her in, the worn dress, the broken bag strap she'd looped around her wrist to keep it from dragging, the boots with the left sole separating slightly from the upper. He didn't say anything unkind, but he didn't hide the assessment either. "That's me," he said. "What do you need?" "I heard in town you lost your cook," she said. 3 weeks ago, at Heller's feed store. Man named Duval mentioned it." "Duval talks too much." "He does," she agreed. "But he wasn't wrong, was he?" Elias Rook set down his pencil. "You cook?" "I do." "For how many?" "However many you've got." He studied her for another moment. "I've got 14 men and I need 3 meals a day. The kitchen's in rough shape. The last cook left because he said the stove wasn't safe to use. I haven't had time to figure out if he was right." "Let me look at it," she said. He hesitated. Not because he doubted her exactly, more like a man who had been disappointed enough times that hesitation had become his first reaction to anything. "If the stove's not safe," Merritt added, "I'll tell you honestly, I won't cook on something that's going to burn the building down." That, apparently, was the right thing to say. He gestured toward the back of the house. The kitchen was worse than rough. The stove had a cracked firebox door and the flue damper was stuck halfway open, which meant that every fire burned uneven. Too hot in some spots, not hot enough in others, and constantly leaking smoke into the room. The walls near the ceiling were stained dark. Someone had shoved a rag into the gap between the damper handle and the housing, probably to try to stop the rattling, and the rag had scorched brown at the edges. The pantry was a separate small room off the back, and Merritt walked into it and stood there for a moment without speaking. Flour sacks sat directly on the dirt floor. Several had moisture damage at the bottoms. The flour inside had gone hard in patches, turning to something closer to paste than powder. Salt had clumped into a solid block inside an uncovered tin. There were onions going soft in a crate that had no airflow. A side of bacon hung from a hook near the single small window, but the window faced south and in the afternoon would catch direct sun, which meant the bacon had been slowly warming and cooling and warming again every day. Nobody had done this on purpose. That was the thing. Nobody had deliberately set out to ruin the supplies. They just never had anyone look at the system and think about what would happen 6 weeks from now. Merritt came back out into the kitchen. Elias was standing in the doorway watching her. "The stove can be fixed," she said. "The damper's seized, probably rust. It'll need to be worked free and oiled. The firebox door needs to be replaced, or at least patched with fire clay until you can get a proper part from town. It's not dangerous if you know what you're doing, but the last cook probably didn't, and I understand why he left." "And the pantry?" She told him. Flour on the floor, moisture damage, the bacon in the wrong spot, the salt tin uncovered. She didn't make it sound like an accusation. She just listed it. Elias rubbed the back of his neck. "How much of the flour is ruined?" "Maybe a third. Could be less if the center's held. I won't know until I work through the sacks. I can't afford to replace a third of the flour right now." "You won't have to replace all of it," she said. "The hard patches can be broken up and sifted. It won't make good bread, but it'll hold together for biscuits and thickening. Nothing has to be thrown out yet." He looked at her for a moment. "You want the job?" "Yes." "I pay $12 a month, and you get room and board. There's a small room off the kitchen. Previous cook used it." $12 a month was less than she'd hoped for, and more than she had. "That's fine," she said. "What's your name?" "Merritt Veil." He nodded, the way men nod when they're committing something to memory. "When can you start?" "I already started," she said, and went back into the pantry to move the flour sacks off the floor. The ranch hands did not welcome her the way she might have liked. They weren't hostile, exactly. Most of them were simply indifferent in the way that people are indifferent to replaceable things. The third cook in 2 years showing up was about as remarkable as a new mop handle. They ate what was put in front of them. They grunted when the coffee was ready. They didn't say thank you with any real feeling behind it, but they didn't complain either, which she quickly understood was about the best you could hope for. The exception was Bram. Bram Stuckey had been at Rookbar Ranch for 11 years, and in that time he had apparently appointed himself the institutional memory of the place, which meant that any change was a personal challenge to everything he'd always known. He was somewhere in his late 50s, built like a man who'd spent decades lifting things heavier than he should, with a face that seemed permanently set into an expression of mild skepticism. He watched her move the flour sacks on her first day and didn't offer to help, just stood in the doorway of the pantry with his arms folded. "Previous cook kept them on the floor," he said. "Previous cook left," Merritt answered without turning around. "Before him, we had a man named Hooper who kept everything the same way and nobody died." "How were the biscuits?" A pause. "What?" "The biscuits. Were they good?" "They were fine." "Were they good?" Bram made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "They were edible." "Then we can do better," she said, and went back to stacking the sacks on the board she'd pulled from the back of the barn and set across 2 old nail kegs to get everything off the ground. Bram watched for another minute, then walked away. He didn't help, but he also stopped blocking the doorway, which she decided to count as progress. The stove took her most of the first afternoon. She borrowed a wrench and a small oil can from the tool room, wrapped a rag around the handle of the damper to give herself better grip, and worked the seized mechanism back and forth until it finally gave with a sound like something breaking free of old ice. She oiled it, worked it through the full range until it moved smoothly. Then she built a small test fire and watched the draw. How the smoke moved, how quickly the firebox heated, where the hot spots were, and where the cold spots stayed. The firebox door she patched with clay she mixed herself, pressing it carefully into the crack and letting it cure slowly with the fire banked low. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it would hold through the winter if she was careful. By the time she put supper on the table that first night, she'd been awake for most of 16 hours. She made salt pork and boiled beans, cornbread from the flour she'd sifted and sorted, and coffee that she didn't overboil because overboiled coffee made men irritable in a specific way that she'd learned to avoid. Nothing elaborate, nothing that required more than what was available. The 14 men sat down and ate without ceremony. About halfway through the meal, one of the younger hands, a boy of maybe 19 named Cody, who had the particular energy of someone who was still surprised by most things, looked up and said, "This cornbread's different." "Different how?" she asked from where she was standing near the stove. Better, he said, as though the word surprised him. It's the same cornbread, said one of the older men. It's not, said Cody. Something's different. I sifted the flour, Merritt said, and I didn't let the fat get too hot before I added it. Cody nodded like this explained everything, even though he clearly had no idea what it meant. Several of the other men went back to eating without comment. Bram didn't say anything, but she noticed he had a second piece of cornbread, and he did it quietly, the way a man does something he doesn't want to be caught doing. She started the ledger on her third day. It wasn't a proper ledger, just a composition notebook she'd carried in her bag since her mother's time, with a few pages of her mother's handwriting in the front that she worked around rather than tearing out. She began recording everything that came into the kitchen and everything that went out of it. Weight of flour used per week, pounds of salt pork consumed, how much coffee, how much cornmeal, how many onions. She tracked the hay usage for the animals because she'd asked Elias permission to walk the barn on her first Sunday, and what she saw there made her realize that the food problem and the animal problem were the same problem wearing different clothes. Elias found her at the table one evening with the notebook open in front of her and columns of numbers filling the page. "What's all that?" he asked. "Inventory," she said. He sat down across from her, frowning at the columns. "I know my own inventory." "Do you know you've been using 40% more flour per week than you need to?" she said, and turned the book so he could see. 3 weeks ago, before I got here, the daily bread was being made with roughly this much flour. She pointed to a number she'd calculated backward from what she'd found in the sacks. "That's almost twice what 14 men actually need. The waste is going to scraps, but the scraps aren't being used. They're just going bad." Elias looked at the numbers. Then he looked at her. "You figured that out from checking the sacks?" "From checking the sacks, asking Cody what the portions used to look like, and working backward," she said. "I'm not trying to criticize how things were done. I'm just trying to know what we actually have versus what we think we have. Because winter's coming and those are two very different numbers." He was quiet for a moment. "How long until winter?" he asked. "Based on the temperature drops I've been watching? 6 weeks. Maybe 7 if we're lucky. Probably 6. "That's what I figured too." "Then you need to know exactly what's in that pantry," she said. "Not approximately. Exactly." He looked at the notebook again. The columns were neat, not because she was showing off neatness, but because neat columns are easier to check for errors, and she'd learned that from her mother, who had kept accounts for a laundry in another life. "All right," he said finally. "Keep tracking." "I was going to either way," she said, and turned the book back around. Duck. The problem with the heifers came to her attention on a Wednesday. She was crossing the yard toward the barn to check on the hay situation she'd been monitoring when she heard voices. Elias and one of the senior hands, a quiet man named Garrett, who managed the cattle rotation. They were standing outside the small secondary enclosure near the north end of the barn, and through the fence she could see 9 young heifers, all of them thinner than they should have been for this time of year. She stopped at a distance and watched the animals for a moment before she continued walking. At supper, she asked Garrett about them. "Those 9?" he said. "They've been off feed since late summer. Don't know why. Tried switching the hay. Tried adding more grain. They eat some, but not enough. Mr. Rook's been thinking about selling them before they get any worse." "What are they eating now?" "Standard mix, same as the rest of the herd." "And the rest of the herd is doing all right?" "Well enough." Merritt thought about this while she was cleaning up after supper. The next morning she went to the enclosure and spent an hour just watching the 9 heifers. Not doing anything, just watching how they moved, how they approached the feed, which ones stepped back when others stepped forward, whether they were drinking normally. What she noticed was that 3 of them were reluctant to chew. Not unwilling to eat, exactly. They'd approach the feed, take something into their mouth, and then seem to give up on it and drop it again. One of the others was eating but had a dull look around the eyes that wasn't quite sickness but wasn't health either. She went into the barn and looked at the stored hay. Then she looked at the grain mix in the bin. Then she went back to the kitchen and started experimenting. It took her 4 days to arrive at something she was willing to test. She had access to bran, which was left over from the flour sifting. She had dried corn that was a grade too coarse for the cornmeal she was making, which meant it was essentially sitting unused. She had the outer leaves of the cabbages she'd been using for the ranch hands' meals, which she'd been saving anyway because she didn't waste things out of habit. She found some dried molasses that had been in the back of the pantry since what looked like the previous year, hard in its tin but still good when she heated it and worked it loose. She mixed these together with the standard grain in varying proportions, made small test batches, and brought them out to the enclosure each morning. Bram watched her on the second day with an expression that suggested he was deciding whether to say something dismissive or just walk away. He went with something dismissive. "You know, feeding scraps to cattle isn't something that's done," he said. "It's not scraps," she said. "It's a supplement mix. It's kitchen leavings. The bran is from the flour mill. The corn is food grade. The molasses is... You're feeding them cabbage leaves. Cattle eat roughage," she said. "Bram, do you want those 9 heifers to be alive in February or not?" He was quiet. "Because right now they're on their way to not being alive in February," she said. "And they're worth money that this ranch needs. So I'm trying something. It might not work, but it's not going to hurt them." He walked away without answering. By the 4th day, 2 of the reluctant eaters were taking the supplement mix without hesitation. By the 7th day, all 9 were eating more consistently than they had in weeks. The one with the dull eyes had a different quality to her face. Not bright, exactly, but present in a way she hadn't been. Merritt updated the ledger. It was on a Thursday, near the end of the 5th week, that she first noticed the weather signs she didn't like. She noticed them separately before she noticed them together. The chimney smoke from the ranch house was lying flat rather than rising. Not because the damper was wrong, she'd fixed that, but because the air pressure had changed in a way that pushed the smoke sideways. The horses in the main pasture were clustering at the southeast fence rather than spreading out the way they normally did. A pair of geese she'd been watching cross the sky every evening had stopped appearing. She stood in the yard for a long time one morning, looking at the sky and then at the mountains to the northwest. The peaks were clearer than usual, which seemed like good news but wasn't. When you could see the mountains that sharply in late autumn, it usually meant the air was being pushed hard from the north, and the moisture hadn't built up yet. It would build up. She went inside and looked at the ledger. Then she opened to a fresh page and started writing a different kind of list. Elias found her still at it 2 hours later. "You haven't started lunch," he said, not as a complaint but as an observation. He'd learned quickly that she was never not working. "I know, I'll start in 10 minutes. She didn't look up. "Sit down a minute." He sat. She turned the notebook so he could see the new page. "That's what we have. That's what I think we're going to need." She put her finger on a column of numbers. "The gap between those 2 things is the problem." He studied the page. "You think the storm's coming early?" "I think it's coming hard, whether it comes early or not. Most years we get through to December before anything serious." "Most years," she said. "Look at the smoke." She nodded toward the chimney. He could see it through the small window over the dry sink, lying flat and sideways. "That started 2 days ago. The horses are stacking at the southeast fence. The geese I've been watching stopped flying over." "You're reading geese." "My mother taught me to read everything," she said. "She said the world tells you things if you stop talking long enough to hear it." He was quiet for a moment, not dismissive, just thinking. "What do you need?" he asked. "More hay than you've ordered, and someone needs to check the water line from the well to the barn. If that freezes, we lose the cattle water, and then we've got a different problem, and I need another 50 pounds of grain before the roads get unreliable." "That's money I wasn't planning to spend this month." "I know," she said. "You should spend it anyway." He looked at the numbers again, looked at the smoke through the window. "I'll talk to Garrett about the water line," he said. It wasn't a full yes, but it wasn't a no. Calder Voss arrived on a Friday morning, which she later thought was probably not a coincidence. Businessmen who bought distressed assets usually showed up at the end of the week, when the people they were buying from had been staring at their problems for 4 days straight and were at their most tired. She heard his horse before she saw him. A large roan with good tack, the kind of animal that announced its owner's position before the owner opened his mouth. Then the door opened without a knock, and the man himself was in the room, peeling off his gloves and looking around the space with the particular expression of someone calculating what things were worth. He was younger than she'd expected, 40, maybe, with a careful way of dressing that suggested he thought about it. Dark coat, clean boots despite the mud on the road, a hat he took off and set on the table as though claiming the space. "Rook," he said. "Good to see you. I've been thinking about our last conversation." Elias, who had been at the table with his papers again, sat up straighter. "Calder. I wanted to follow up on the question of the young cattle." Voss unfolded a piece of paper from his coat pocket and set it beside his hat. "I've put together something in writing. I think it's fair given the condition of the animals." Merritt kept her hands moving at the stove. She didn't turn around. She heard Elias unfold the paper. Heard the silence. "This is lower than what you mentioned last time," Elias said. "The animals are in worse condition than last time," Voss said. "It's the same calculation. I'm taking a risk buying animals that might not make it to spring, and the price reflects that." He paused. "I'm actually doing you a favor, Elias. You can't afford to feed 9 questionable heifers through a hard winter. Cut them loose now. Take what I'm offering, and put the money toward what you actually need." Merritt set down the spoon she was holding. She turned around. Voss looked at her with a mild expression that was somehow more insulting than outright dismissal. "She your cook?" he said to Elias. "She is." "Then she should be cooking." He smiled at her, the kind of smile that came with a firm wall behind it. "This is a business conversation, miss. I'm sure you've got work to do." Merritt looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her notebook from the shelf beside the stove and walked to the table and set it down next to his contract. Voss looked at it, then at her. "What's this?" he said. "Numbers," she said. "Same as yours, but different." She opened to the page she'd been working on and turned it so both men could see. "Those 9 heifers have gained an average of 6 pounds each in the past 3 weeks, she said. "I've been supplementing their feed with a mix I developed. They're eating consistently now. They're not animals in distress anymore. They're animals that were being fed wrong. There's a difference." Voss looked at the page, then at Elias. "Your cook keeps records on the cattle?" he said. The tone wasn't angry, it was something worse, amused. "She does," Elias said, and there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before, a steadiness. "With respect," Voss said, setting his hands flat on the table, "I don't think a woman who manages a kitchen is in a position to advise on livestock transactions." "I'm not advising on the transaction," Merritt said. "I'm telling you the animals are worth more than you're offering. That's just arithmetic." Voss looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Elias. "She always like this?" "Pretty much," Elias said. There was a beat. Then Elias slid the contract back across the table. "I'm going to think about it," he said. Voss picked up the contract with the careful movements of someone who had expected a different answer. He folded it slowly, put it back in his pocket, and picked up his hat. "Don't think too long," he said. "My offer has a window. The window closes when the snow comes." He put his hat on, nodded once to Elias, didn't look at Merritt again, and walked out. The door swung closed behind him. The room was very quiet. Elias looked at the notebook on the table, then at her. 6 pounds each? He said. "Average," she said. "Cody's been weighing them for me on Mondays." Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I almost called after him, almost said yes before you put that book down." "I know," she said. "Is the storm really coming?" She looked at the window. The smoke from the chimney was lying almost completely flat in the still air. "It's coming," she said. "We need to be ready." Voss's horse was still visible through the kitchen window, just a shape moving down the road through the pines, when Bram walked in through the back door and stopped cold. He looked at the notebook on the table, looked at Elias, looked at Merritt. "What did that man want?" he said. "The heifers," Elias said. Bram set down the bucket he was carrying and pulled out a chair. He sat in it the way old men sit in chairs when they're preparing to have an opinion. "How much he offer?" Elias told him. Bram's jaw moved like he was working on something tough. "That's low." "That's what I said," Merritt told him. He looked at her. I wasn't asking you. I know, she said, and went back to the stove. There was a silence in the room that had a particular quality to it, the kind of silence that exists when two people are on the same side of an argument without being willing to admit they got there the same way. Bram sat with his hands on the table. Elias looked at his papers. The fire in the stove clicked and settled. Those heifers aren't worth what he's offering, Bram said finally. Even in the shape they're in. They're not in the shape he thinks they're in, Elias said. Bram looked up. What do you mean? Elias nodded toward Merritt. She didn't turn around, just said, 6 pounds average gain in 3 weeks. They're eating consistently now. The supplement mix is holding. Another silence. Different quality this time. Huh, said Bram. That was all he said. But Merritt had been listening to Bram long enough now to understand that coming from him, was not nothing. It was the sound a man made when he was revising something he'd already decided. She poured the coffee and didn't smile about it. The 2 weeks that followed Voss's visit were the kind of weeks that didn't feel significant while they were happening, but turned out to be everything. Merritt established a routine so fixed that the ranch hands started adjusting their own schedules around it. Breakfast at 5:30, with coffee ready at 5:15 for the men who came in early from the barn. Lunch at noon, always something that could be kept warm without drying out, because the men never came in exactly at noon. Supper at 6, which was the meal she put the most thought into, because supper was when people sat down long enough to actually become people again, rather than just bodies doing work. She started keeping a second notebook, a smaller one that she kept in her apron pocket, specifically for what she observed rather than what she counted. She wrote things like, Garrett's left knee is giving him trouble. He favors it on the stairs and doesn't complain, but I can see it in how he sits down. And Cody has been staying in the barn later than his shift requires. Something's eating at him, not sure what yet. And the roan mare in the south pasture is off her water intake, check with Garrett. It wasn't that she was trying to manage people. She wasn't built that way. It was more that she'd grown up in a household where noticing things was a matter of survival, and the habit didn't stop just because she had a roof over her head now. Her mother had been a woman who could walk into a room and understand the state of it in about 30 seconds, who was fighting, who was pretending not to be, what had run out that nobody wanted to admit had run out. Merritt had watched her do it for 22 years and absorbed the method the way you absorb a language spoken around you from childhood. She missed her mother in a way that didn't peak and then fade. It just sat at a steady level, like background noise you stopped hearing until something reminded you it was there. The dried berries she kept in the small cloth pouch at the bottom of her canvas bag were that reminder. Her mother had given them to her 2 days before she died, pressed them into her hand and said, "These are for when you have nothing else." Merritt hadn't eaten them. She didn't think she ever would. They were something else now. None. The hay situation resolved itself partly, and not enough. Elias had authorized an additional delivery from the supplier in Colton, which was the nearest town with a feed operation large enough to matter. The delivery came on a Thursday, which was good. The amount that came was about 70% of what Merritt had calculated they'd need, which was less good. She updated the ledger, looked at the numbers, did the arithmetic 3 different ways because doing it 3 ways was how you caught the errors, and also how you confirmed that the answer was the same no matter how you approached it. It was the same. She went to find Elias. He was in the barn with Garrett, looking at the water line that ran from the well to the animal troughs. She stood at the barn door and waited until he saw her. "Problem?" he said. "Question," she said. "The hay delivery. Was that the full order or a partial?" "Partial. Full delivery comes next week." She nodded. "How certain is next week?" He and Garrett exchanged a look. "Vince at the feed store said next week," Elias said. "He's usually reliable." "Usually," she said. "What's the road condition been like between here and Colton when it rains?" Garrett made a sound. "Rough. There's a low section past the creek crossing that gets bad." "How bad?" "Wagon stuck bad," Garrett said. "Last October we had a supply run that took 4 days because the wagon got bogged twice." Merritt looked at the sky through the barn door. It was flat and white, in a way that had been building for the past 3 days. Not dramatic, just consistent, the way serious weather built. If the second delivery doesn't come before the road closes, she said, we're short on hay by roughly this much. She handed Elias the page she'd torn from the ledger. He looked at it. That's not catastrophic. It's not. As long as winter runs normal. If we get an extended cold stretch by 2 weeks or more without a break, we start making hard choices about which animals get fed and which don't. She paused. The 9 heifers would be the first hard choice. Elias folded the paper slowly. What do you want me to do? Send someone to Colton today, she said. Pay for whatever they can load and bring back now. Don't wait for next week's scheduled delivery. That means paying twice for delivery. It means not losing animals you decided not to sell to Voss, she said. Your choice, which is more expensive. He looked at the paper again, then at Garrett. Who can we spare today? He said. She was wrong about one thing. She'd calculated the supplement mix for the heifers on a 7-day consumption cycle, which meant she was making a fresh batch every Sunday and checking the animals every Monday with Cody for the weight measurements she'd been tracking. On the 4th Monday, she noticed that 2 of the heifers were eating the supplement faster than the others, going through their portion in about 2/3 of the time. This could mean several things. It could mean they'd developed a preference for the molasses-heavy mix and were simply eating enthusiastically. It could mean they'd been slightly underfed during the summer and their systems were compensating. It could also mean something was off in their gut that was making them hunger for specific nutrients. She wasn't a veterinarian. She was very clear about this in her own mind. But she'd grown up watching her mother manage the practical care of animals on 2 different homesteads, and one of the things her mother had said more than once was, when an animal changes its behavior suddenly, it's telling you something. Your job is to figure out what. She adjusted the mix for those 2 animals, reducing the molasses slightly and increasing the bran, and watched for 3 days. They leveled out. Cody was with her on the 3rd observation morning, leaning on the fence and watching the heifers work through the feed. That one on the left, he said. She wasn't eating at all when you first got here. I know, Merritt said. What was wrong with her? I'm not completely certain. My best guess is that the standard grain mix was too coarse for her to chew comfortably. She's got slightly smaller teeth than the others. The finer grind in the supplement mix is easier for her. Cody looked at the heifer. You figured that out by watching her drop feed. By watching her drop feed about 40 times over 3 days, yes. He was quiet for a moment. Bram said you were wasting kitchen scraps on cattle. Bram says a lot of things. He's been telling the men you don't know what you're doing. She kept her eyes on the heifers. What do the men say back? Mostly nothing, Cody said. But Delt said the food's been better since you got here. And Harlow said his stomach hasn't bothered him in 3 weeks, which he says is a record. He paused. I didn't tell Bram that part. You can if you want, she said. It won't change anything. Cody looked at her. Doesn't that bother you, that he's going around saying that? She thought about it honestly. A little, she said. But I've got about 6 weeks of work ahead of me that's going to matter more than what Bram says now. So I'm trying to stay focused on that. Cody nodded slowly, the way young people nod when they're filing something away to think about later. The argument with Bram happened on a Wednesday, and like most real arguments, it didn't start about the thing it was actually about. It started about the firewood. Merritt had been watching the wood supply and had been noting in her smaller notebook that the men were burning through it faster than necessary, stacking the firebox too full, letting fires run hot when they didn't need to, leaving the damper open when the room was already warm. Over the course of a week, this added up to more waste than she could be comfortable with going into winter. She brought it up at supper, not as a lecture, just mentioned that they were running through wood quickly and asked if anyone would mind banking the fires lower in the evenings since the bunkhouse held heat well once it was up to temperature. Bram put down his fork. We've been managing fires in this bunkhouse for 11 years, he said. I know, she said. I'm just asking about the rate of use. The rate of use is fine. We've gone through a third of the stacked supply in 5 weeks, she said. That rate doesn't hold through a full winter. It's held every other winter. Has it? She said. Or have you just been lucky that the supply runs kept coming through when you needed them? The table got quiet. Bram's face did something complex. a kind of reddening that wasn't entirely anger. Some of it was the look of a man who'd just heard something he suspected was true and didn't want to be true. "You've been here 6 weeks," he said. "6 weeks? You don't know our winters." "You're right," she said, "but I know your firewood count and I know what a hard winter requires. The numbers don't care how long I've been here." "Your numbers," he said, like the word tasted wrong. "Your little book with your little numbers. You've been walking around this ranch with that book for 6 weeks, writing down everything you see like you're going to submit a report to somebody." "I'm trying to make sure nobody starves," she said. "Nobody on this ranch has starved." "Not yet," she said. It came out harder than she intended. She didn't take it back. Bram pushed his chair back and stood up. "I've kept this ranch running through 3 owners and 2 droughts and 1 flood. I don't need a woman who makes cornbread to tell me how to burn wood." He walked out. The door closed, but not quite a slam, which was somehow worse than a slam, because it suggested he was controlling himself, and that took more anger, not less. The table was very quiet. Elias was at the far end, looking at his plate. Merritt looked at the men along the table. Some of them were watching her. Some were looking at the door. "I'll refill the coffee," she said, and went to the stove. Elias came to the kitchen after supper, after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the dishes were done. He sat at the table with both hands around a mug that had gone cold and said, "How bad is the firewood situation, honestly?" She sat across from him and opened the ledger. "If the winter runs the way last winter ran, according to what Garrett told me, we're fine. If it runs harder, which I think it will, we're short by about 3 weeks of hard burning, maybe more." "What's your fix?" "2 things," she said. "Bank the fires lower at night, which is what I said at supper. And there's a stand of deadfall timber in the northwest draw that Garrett mentioned, about a mile out. If someone splits and hauls that before the snow comes, it solves the problem. That's 3 days' work for 2 men." "Yes." Elias turned the mug in his hands. "Bram's not entirely wrong, you know. He's kept things running here longer than most people have been willing to." "I know that," she said. "But he's also not entirely right." "I know that too." Elias looked at her. "You're not going to apologize to him." It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. "I'll apologize for how I said it. I could have handled that better. But I'm not going to apologize for the numbers." He almost smiled. "Fair enough." He put down the mug. "I'll send 2 men to the northwest draw starting Thursday. Don't tell Bram I said it was your idea." "I don't care whose idea he thinks it is," she said. "I just care that it gets done." The first real cold snap arrived on a Saturday and was sharper than anyone expected. Not the storm. That was still coming, she was certain. This was a warning, the kind of cold that arrived like a scout sent ahead of an army, checking the terrain, reporting back. Temperature dropped 12 degrees overnight. The water bucket in the kitchen had a skin of ice on it by morning. The horses were blowing thick vapor into the air and pressing close to the barn walls. Merritt was up at 4, which was an hour earlier than usual because she'd been awake since 2 and decided lying in bed watching the darkness was a waste of time she didn't have. She built up the kitchen fire and put the coffee on, and then went to check the pantry. Everything was where it should be. The flour sacks were raised and dry. The salt tins were covered. The root vegetables were packed in straw the way she'd reorganized them 3 weeks ago. The bacon had been moved to the cooler north-facing storage room, which was now cold enough that it was effectively a larder without any intervention needed. She went back to the kitchen and sat at the table with the ledger and a candle and went through the numbers again. The hay situation had improved. Elias had sent Garrett and Cody to Colton, and they'd come back with a full additional load, enough to close most of the gap. The firewood situation was improved, but not resolved. The men Elias had sent to the northwest draw had gotten 1.5 days of splitting done before rain had interrupted, which meant there was still work to finish. The water line from the well to the barn had been checked by Garrett, who'd reported a section of exposed pipe near the north barn wall that he'd wrapped in burlap as a temporary measure. She wrote a note in the ledger. "Burlap won't be enough if temperature drops another 10 degrees. Needs proper insulation or heat source nearby. Talk to E." She was making a second list, things to do that day specifically, when she heard the door to the bunkhouse open and close, and then boots on the cold ground, and then Bram appeared in the kitchen doorway. He stopped when he saw her at the table. She'd been expecting to see Cody or one of the early risers, not Bram. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He had his coat on and his hat, and he was carrying his own mug, which meant he'd come for coffee and hadn't expected to have to negotiate a room to get it. She gestured toward the stove. He came in, poured his coffee, didn't sit down, stood at the counter with his back to her for a moment, and she went back to her list. Then he said, without turning around, "The draw timber. That was you." It wasn't a question. "Elias decided to do it," she said, based on what you told him. "Based on the firewood count," she said, "which is in the ledger if you want to look at it." A silence. She heard him drink his coffee. "How short were we?" he said. 3 weeks of hard burning, maybe more." Another silence. Longer. "We had a winter 8 years ago," Bram said, still not turning around. "That ran cold from November through the end of February. We almost didn't make it. Lost 4 head of cattle and one of the horses." He paused. "I've been trying not to think about that winter since September." Merritt put down her pencil. "I know," she said. He turned around, looked at her. His face had the particular expression of a man who was in the process of changing his mind about something and hated how that felt. "The numbers," he said. "You're sure about them?" "I'm sure about the count," she said. "I can't be sure about the winter. Nobody can be sure about the winter." He nodded, looked into his mug. "The biscuits," he said. She waited. "They're better," he said. "I wasn't going to say it, but they are." She picked her pencil back up. "Thank you, Bram." He made the huss sound and went back out into the cold morning. Calder Voss came back on the following Tuesday. She saw the roan through the kitchen window before she heard it, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not quite fear, more like the feeling of a card game where you've just realized the other person has been holding something you didn't know about. She kept working. He came through the door the same way as before. No knock, coat already open like the room was already his. But this time Elias was standing in the middle of the main room rather than sitting, which was different, and Merritt noticed it. "Elias," Voss said. "I was in the area. Thought I'd follow up." "You thought you'd see if I'd changed my mind," Elias said. Voss smiled. "Is there a difference?" "Might be," Elias said. "Sit down." Voss sat. He glanced toward the kitchen, saw Merritt, and looked away again with the same quality of dismissal as before, the kind that wasn't quite rude enough to call out, but sat wrong anyway. "The heifers," Voss said. "My offer stands. But I need an answer before the first serious snow. After that, the roads become a problem, and I can't move animals safely." "What's your timeline?" Elias said. 2 weeks, maybe 3 if the weather holds mild." He leaned back in his chair with the ease of a man who believed he was the most comfortable person in any room he occupied. "I know you've been worried about the winter supply situation. I've heard things in town about your hay delivery situation. If those animals don't have adequate feed—" "Who told you about the hay delivery?" Elias said. Voss waved a hand. "People talk. Colton's a small town. The feed store keeps records." He paused. "I'm not trying to embarrass you, Elias. I'm trying to offer you a practical solution." "The hay situation is handled," Elias said. Voss looked at him steadily. "Is it?" "It is." A beat. Voss's eyes moved briefly to the kitchen, back to Elias. "How many of the 9 are still eating normally?" he said. "All 9, Elias said. Voss didn't react to this the way she'd expected. He didn't dispute it or push back. He simply sat with it for a moment, the way a man sits with information that doesn't fit his model, figuring out where to put it. Then he said, "My offer doesn't change based on their current condition. It's based on their projected condition through a hard winter with limited feed. Even if they're eating well now, a bad February can undo 3 months of gains." "That's a risk I've decided to take," Elias said. Merritt heard the steadiness in it. 3 weeks ago, she didn't think Elias would have said it that way. He would have said he was thinking about it. He would have said, maybe. Voss folded his hands on the table. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'd like to see the animals." "Help yourself," Elias said. "Enclosure's north of the barn." Voss stood. He looked toward the kitchen one more time. "I'd also like to see your supply records," he said. Inventory, hay consumption, the feed schedule for the heifers. The room was very still. Why? Elias said. Because if I'm going to understand the real condition of this operation, Voss said, with a careful reasonableness that sat poorly, I need to see the full picture, not just the animals, but the systems around them. Elias looked at Merritt. She came out from the kitchen with the ledger. She set it on the table in front of Voss and opened it to the first page of the heifer records. Weight measurements, dates, feed composition, consumption rates. 7 weeks of data in columns clean enough to follow without explanation. Voss looked at the page, then flipped back to the beginning, then forward through several pages. His face didn't change, but something behind it did. A small tightening around the eyes, like a man recalibrating. Your cook put this together, he said. Not quite a question. I did, Merritt said. He looked up at her. You've been keeping records on the heifers since when? Since the 4th week I was here, she said. Before that I was assessing. The formal tracking started once I had the supplement mix stable. And the supplement mix is not something I'm sharing with you, she said pleasantly. Voss looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite respect, but was some third thing she didn't have a clean word for. He closed the ledger, pushed it back toward her. Interesting operation, he said. It's a good ranch, Merritt said. It just needed someone to pay attention to it. He stood, looked at Elias. I'll check on the animals, he said, and then I'll be in touch. He walked out. Elias waited until the sound of boots on the porch steps had faded, then let out a long breath. He's going to come back with a different approach, Merritt said. You think so? He's smart, she said. Smart enough to know that the number he put on paper isn't going to work anymore. He'll come back with something else. What? I don't know yet, she said, but I think we should find out what he knows about your debt situation before he gets here. Elias went very still. Why? Because he mentioned the hay delivery, she said, and the feed store's records. And he asked about the supply system specifically, not just the animals. She picked up the ledger. He's not just trying to buy heifers, Elias. He's trying to understand the full picture. Your words, but he said them for a reason. Elias sat down heavily. You think he's looking at the ranch, he said. I think he's looking at what the ranch owes, she said, and what it's worth, and whether those two numbers leave room for something else. The fire in the stove clicked. Outside, she could hear Voss's boots on the frozen ground heading toward the barn. Elias looked at the table, at nothing in particular on it. My debt situation, he said slowly, is not something I've talked about with anyone here. I know, she said. How bad is it? A long silence, the kind that told her the answer before he gave it. Bad enough, he said, that if Voss knew the exact number, he might not need to buy the heifers at all. She sat down across from him. The ledger was open between them. Then we need to make sure, she said, that what he sees when he looks at this ranch is not a man drowning in debt. We need him to see something worth more than what he's owed. And how do we do that? The same way we've been doing everything else, she said. Numbers, evidence, preparation. She looked at the window, the flat white sky pressed down on the pines. And we need to be ready before that storm comes, because when it does, everything you owe and everything you own is going to be settled by what's still standing on the other side of it. Elias looked at her for a long moment. You figured all this out from watching his face when he looked at the ledger? From watching his face, she said, and from the fact that he asked about the supply systems and not the animals. A man buying cattle asks about the cattle. A man buying a ranch asks about everything else. Outside, the wind had picked up, not dramatically, just enough to move the smoke from the chimney flat against the sky and push the dry grass along the fence line in one persistent direction. The same direction it had been pushing for 3 days now. She closed the ledger and stood up. I need to go check on the heifer's water, she said. And when I'm done with that, I want to talk to you about the pipe Garrett wrapped in burlap. The burlap around the pipe lasted 4 more days before Merritt decided it wasn't going to be enough. She knew it the morning she went to check and found a thin crescent of ice forming at the joint where the pipe bent around the north barn wall. Not a full freeze. Not yet. But ice at a joint meant the temperature at that spot was already below what the wrapping could handle, and the temperature was still dropping. She stood there in the cold with her hand on the pipe, feeling the metal through the burlap, and thought about what Elias had said when she'd raised it. "We'll deal with it if it becomes a problem." It was becoming a problem. She went to find Garrett. He was in the barn running a brush over the roan mare, not Voss's roan, their own, a working animal named Fleck, who had been at Rookbar longer than most of the hands. Garrett had a particular relationship with that horse that didn't require explanation. He just brushed her when something was on his mind. "The joint on the north side," Merritt said from the barn door. "There's ice starting at the bend." Garrett didn't stop brushing. "How much?" "Crescent, maybe 2 inches across. It'll be a full freeze in another cold night or two." "Temperature's supposed to hold this week," he said. "Supposed to," she said. "According to who?" He stopped brushing, looked at her over Fleck's back. "You don't trust the almanac." "I trust what I can see," she said, "and what I can see is ice at that joint." He was quiet for a moment. Fleck shifted her weight and exhaled through her nose. "What do you want to do about it?" he said. "There's old lamp oil in the back storage. If we hang 2 lamps close to that section of pipe on the coldest nights, the heat from the flames will keep the temperature up just enough to prevent a full freeze. It's not elegant, but it'll work until we can get proper insulation on it." Garrett set the brush down on the stall rail. "That's a fire risk." "It's a managed risk," she said. "Lamps on hooks, nothing flammable within 2 feet. I've done it before on a different property. It works if you're careful." "And if we're not careful?" "Then we have a different problem," she admitted. "But a frozen water line means the animals can't drink, which means we're hauling water by hand from the house well in the middle of a blizzard, which means someone gets hurt or the animals go without, and neither of those is acceptable." Garrett picked the brush back up, not to use it, just to have something in his hand. "I'll hang the lamps tonight," he said. "You tell Elias." "Already planning on it," she said. Elias didn't argue about the lamps. He was past arguing about the small things she'd noticed. The larger thing on his mind was the question she'd left him with at the end of their conversation about Voss. What exactly the man knew about the ranch's debt and what he intended to do with that knowledge. He'd spent 2 evenings going through his own papers, a process that she gathered was not pleasant. He wasn't a man who kept meticulous records. He kept the important things, the land deeds, the loan documents, the correspondence with the bank in Colton. But they were in a lockbox under his bed, and he hadn't opened that box in several months because the numbers inside it had a way of ruining a day. She didn't press him. She let him work through it at whatever pace a man works through the things he's been avoiding, which is never the pace you'd choose if you were watching from outside. On the 3rd evening, he came to the kitchen after supper with a folder of papers and sat at the table and spread them out. "Here's where I am," he said. She came to the table and sat across from him. He walked her through it. A loan taken out 2 years ago against the land to cover a bad cattle season. Another smaller loan the following spring for equipment. The interest on both had been manageable in a good year. In a bad year, or a year where the cattle numbers were down, it ate into the operating margin in a way that left him consistently short. "Voss knows about this?" she said. "I think he knows about the first loan," Elias said. "The bank in Colton is... There are people there who talk. I've suspected it for a while. What happens if you can't make the winter payment?" He smoothed one of the papers with his palm, a gesture that had no practical purpose. "The bank has the right to call the full amount. They probably won't, first time, but it gives them leverage. And if Voss is connected to the bank..." "I don't know that he is," Elias said, "but you don't know that he isn't." A silence. "No," he said. "I don't know that he isn't." Merritt looked at the papers. Loan amounts, interest rates, payment schedules. She didn't know everything about how these arrangements worked, but she understood the basic shape of it. The way debt could be used not just as a financial instrument, but as a mechanism of pressure, tightened slowly, applied at the right moment. "What's the winter payment?" she said. He told her. She was quiet for a moment. "Can you make it?" "If nothing goes wrong," he said, If the hay costs don't go higher, if the animals stay healthy, if I don't have any equipment failures, he paused. If. Okay, she said. Okay, he repeated, like the word puzzled him slightly. That's manageable, she said. It's tight, but it's manageable. The key thing is making sure Voss doesn't get a look at something that lets him push the bank before you're ready. She pulled the ledger to her side of the table, which means what this ranch looks like on paper matters. And right now, on paper, it looks like a place that's been running carelessly. I've been fixing that for 2 months, but I want to be more intentional about it. What does that mean? It means I want to put together a document, she said. A real one. Supply inventory, animal status, feed schedules, winter preparedness. Something that shows the ranch as what it actually is now, not what it was 6 months ago. She looked at him. If Voss or the bank wants to look at the operation, I want there to be something to show them that tells a different story than the one they've been assuming. Elias looked at the papers on the table. His papers. The debt, the pressure, the numbers he'd been avoiding. Then he looked at her ledger. How long will that take you? 3 days if you help me understand the things I don't know yet, she said. 4 if you don't. He almost smiled again, the same almost smile as before, the one that seemed to surprise him when it happened. Ask me what you need to know, he said. Okay. The document took 4 days because on the second day, the weather turned and everyone on the ranch had other problems. It started as sleet, not the dramatic beginning she'd been half expecting, just a gray afternoon that went grayer and then started ticking against the windows with small ice pellets that melted on contact with anything warm and froze on contact with anything cold. The yard developed a glaze. The steps of the bunkhouse became treacherous. Cody slipped on the second step coming down from supper and caught himself on the rail, but wrenched his right shoulder doing it, which put him out of heavy work for the rest of the week. She checked his shoulder herself because the nearest doctor was in Colton and nobody was driving to Colton in sleet. She knew enough to determine it wasn't dislocated. The joint was intact and he could move the arm, just not without pain. She strapped it with strips of cloth and told him to keep it still for 3 days. 3 days, he said, sitting at the kitchen table with his face doing the thing young men's faces do when they're trying not to show how much something hurts. I've got work. You've got a shoulder that'll heal right if you rest it, or heal wrong if you don't, she said. Your choice, but you'll be carrying that choice for a long time either way. He stayed off heavy work for 3 days. The sleet stopped after 2 days, but the cold that followed it was sharper than before. The real advance now. The kind of cold that settled in and didn't apologize. The lamp situation at the pipe had been working, Garrett confirmed, but 2 nights of this temperature meant they needed to keep the lamps lit continuously rather than just at night, which meant someone needed to check and refill them every few hours. The hands rotated through it without complaint. This surprised her a little, and then it didn't. She'd noticed over the past weeks that what the men responded to wasn't instruction or authority. It was evidence. Show a Rookbar Ranch hand that something mattered and why it mattered, and they would do the work. Tell them to do it because she said so, and they do it slowly with their back teeth clenched. She'd understood this early and had worked accordingly. Bram was the one who took the 2 a.m. lamp check on the second night without being asked. She found out from Garrett the following day. She didn't say anything about it to Bram, but she made sure his coffee was ready before anyone else's that morning. Voss came back on a Thursday, 8 days after his second visit, and this time he brought someone with him. The second man was older, somewhere in his mid-60s, with a careful kind of stillness that suggested either patience or calculation, and glasses that he wore on a cord around his neck rather than on his face, which he put on only when he was looking at something specific. He introduced himself as Aldrin Marsh. Merritt, from the kitchen, heard the name and kept her hands busy and her face neutral. Aldrin Marsh was the name Elias had mentioned in the context of the bank in Colton. Not the bank president, something adjacent to it. A man who did assessments. Voss hadn't brought someone to look at the cattle. He'd brought someone to look at the ranch. She heard Elias greet them both in the main room. She heard the particular quality of his voice, controlled, steady, the voice of a man who'd been warned this might happen and had decided in advance how he was going to handle it. She dried her hands on her apron and came out of the kitchen. Marsh was looking at the main room with his glasses on now. The walls, the ceiling, the woodwork around the windows. Voss was talking to Elias in a low, pleasant voice about road conditions. "Mr. Marsh," Merritt said. Both men turned. Voss's expression did the thing it always did, the small curtain coming down. Marsh looked at her with what she read as genuine curiosity. "Yes?" "I've put together a summary of the ranch's operational condition," she said. "Supply inventory, animal status, and winter preparedness. If you're here to assess the property, it might save some time." Marsh looked at Voss. Voss looked at her. "She's the cook," Voss said, with the patience of a man explaining something simple. "She's also the reason the 9 heifers are still alive and gaining weight," Elias said from across the room, with a flatness that surprised even Merritt. Marsh took off his glasses and let them hang on the cord. "Let's see the document," he said. She'd known it wasn't perfect. She'd done the best she could with 4 days of work and the information Elias had shared with her, but there were gaps she hadn't been able to fill and estimates she'd had to label honestly as estimates rather than hard numbers. A perfect document would have been suspicious anyway. A document with acknowledged uncertainties clearly labeled was more credible than one that claimed to have all the answers. Marsh read through it slowly. He had the reading manner of someone for whom the pace of reading was itself a form of analysis. He didn't skim, and he didn't hurry. And when he turned a page, he went back and checked something on the previous page twice before continuing. Voss stood by the window looking at the yard. Elias sat at the table at an angle where Merritt could see his hands. They were flat on his thighs, which was how he sat when he was keeping himself from fidgeting. She stood near the doorway to the kitchen and watched Marsh read. After about 10 minutes, he set the document on the table and put his glasses back on the cord. "The supplement mix for the young cattle," he said, looking at her. "This is your formulation?" "Yes." "And the weight gain figures? These are from weekly measurements?" "Monday mornings," she said. "Cody Phelps did the weighing. The dates and his initials are on each measurement." Marsh looked at the page again, then at Elias. "When did you hire her?" 8 weeks ago, Elias said. "And before that, what was the status of the 9 heifers?" "Off feed, losing condition. I was considering selling them." Marsh nodded slowly. He looked at the document for another moment. Then he picked it up and held it out to Voss. Voss took it, read through it, faster than Marsh had, with the manner of someone looking for specific things rather than understanding the whole. He turned to the hay inventory page, then to the debt summary that Elias had allowed her to include, framed carefully as a forward-looking payment schedule rather than a list of what was owed. "This is your cook's assessment of your financial position?" Voss said. "It's an accurate one," Elias said. "It's optimistic." "Show me where it's wrong," Merritt said. Voss looked at her. "The numbers are there," she said. "If something is inaccurate, point to it and I'll correct it. But if you're saying it's optimistic because it doesn't match the story you came in here with, that's a different conversation." The room was very quiet. Marsh made a sound, but not quite a laugh, something shorter. He looked at the window and then back at the table. "The winter payment," he said to Elias. "Can you make it?" "Yes," Elias said, "without selling the heifers." "Yes." Marsh looked at the document one more time. Then he stood up. "I've seen what I need to see," he said. He looked at Merritt. "Your name?" "Merritt Veil." He nodded, the committing to memory nod that Elias had given her on her first day. "The operation here is in better condition than the external picture suggested," he said, and this last part was directed at Voss rather than at her. Voss's jaw moved slightly, not quite clenching, just adjusting. "The external picture was accurate 2 months ago," he said. "2 months ago is not now," Marsh said. They left within the hour. Voss first, with the particular energy of a man who was not finished but was choosing to be finished for today. Marsh last, and at the door he paused and looked back at Merritt. "The burlap on the pipe," he said. "I noticed it when I walked the property. Is that a temporary measure?" "The lamps are keeping it from freezing," she said. "It's on my list for permanent insulation as soon as the ground firms up enough to dig the section out properly." He looked at her over his glasses cord. "Good thinking," he said. And then he was out the door. Elias stood in the middle of the main room for a long moment after they'd gone. She could see the shape of what he was feeling, the particular exhaustion of a confrontation that went better than expected but cost something anyway, because bracing for impact takes its toll even when the impact doesn't come. "You knew Marsh was connected to the bank," he said. "It wasn't an accusation." "I suspected," she said, "from the name. I wasn't certain." "And you had the document ready anyway." "I had the document ready because it was the right thing to have ready," she said. "Voss or no Voss, this ranch should have had a proper operational record all along." He sat down. Heavily, the way he'd sat down after the debt conversation. "He's going to come back," Elias said. "Probably," she said, "but he's going to come back to a different situation than he expected. That matters." "Does it change what he wants?" "No," she said honestly, "but it changes what he can do about it. There's a difference between wanting something and being in a position to take it." Elias looked at the table, at the space where the document had been, which Marsh had taken with him. "I should have made another copy," she said. "That was a mistake. I'll remake it." "How long?" 2 hours. I remember most of it." She paused. "Next time I'll make 2. He looked at her, something in his face that she didn't quite have a word for. Not gratitude, which was too simple. Something more complicated than that. The look of a man reassessing the shape of his situation and finding it different than he thought. "Merritt," he said. "You don't have to say anything," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm going to anyway." He paused. "I hired you because I needed a cook, and you showed up. That's the honest version." "I know that," she said. "What you've done here in 8 weeks, the ledger, the heifers, the document, all of it." He stopped, started again. "I didn't know that was possible. From a kitchen." "Everything is possible from a kitchen," she said, "if you're paying attention to the right things." He nodded, didn't say anything else. She went back to the kitchen to start on the second copy of the document. But the storm arrived on a Tuesday, 11 days after Voss's second visit, and it arrived the way she'd been expecting. Not dramatically, but with a kind of settled inevitability, like something that had been planned from a long way off and was simply now arriving on schedule. The morning was ordinary, cold, gray, the usual sounds of the ranch waking up. By mid-morning, the sky had gone a particular shade that she recognized. Not black, not dramatic, just a deep flat white that pressed down on everything like a ceiling getting lower. The wind was from the northwest, and it wasn't gusting, it was simply blowing at a steady pace that suggested it intended to keep doing so. She'd been preparing for 11 days. The pantry was at full inventory, everything raised, covered, organized by use frequency, so nothing got buried behind something else. The stove had been serviced again. She'd made Bram help her clear the flue completely because the season's first heavy use had left deposits she didn't like. The firewood from the northwest draw had been stacked and covered under the lean-to on the south wall of the bunkhouse, which was the position with the most shelter from the direction she'd expected the wind to come from. The heifers were in the enclosed section of the barn. She'd made sure their water trough had extra capacity the day before, and the lamp setup on the pipe had been running continuously for the past week. At noon, she made the ranch hands eat a full meal before they went out to do the afternoon check on the animals. Not because she was being particular about schedules, because she knew that once the snow came in earnest, the afternoon check might turn into an extended situation, and she wanted them going into it fed. "You're feeding us like we're going to war," Delt said, which was the most words he'd said at a meal table in 2 months. "I'm feeding you like the weather is about to make your afternoon harder than usual," she said. "Eat the second biscuit, Delt." He ate the second biscuit. The snow started at 2 in the afternoon. Not hard, just beginning, the way it always began, with the small flakes that seemed almost casual. By 3, it had weight behind it. By 4, the yard was covered, and the fence lines were softening at the edges, and the visibility to the tree line was about 40% of normal. Garrett came back from the afternoon check with snow in his beard and the look of a man who'd been outside long enough to have thought about things. "Temperature's dropping fast," he said, standing in the kitchen doorway and refusing to come in because his boots were wet. "The main herd is settled, but we're going to need to check the water trough lines in the north pasture by morning." The lamps are still going? As of an hour ago, yes. Harlow's on the evening check. She nodded. Anything else? The mare's off her feed, he said. Fleck? Not bad, just a little off. Might be the pressure change. I'll look at her tomorrow if it continues, she said. Right now, just make sure she's warm. He nodded and went back out. By supper time, the snow was serious. She could hear it against the windows. Not howling, not the dramatic movie version of a blizzard. Just a consistent presence, a weight of sound that said this was going to go on for a while. The men came in from the last check of the evening, stamping snow off their boots and moving with the particular heaviness of people who'd been fighting cold all day. She had stew ready, the real kind, not the watered version, thick with the root vegetables she'd been saving and the last of the salt pork she'd been rationing specifically for a heavy weather meal. Cornbread, hot coffee. Nobody talked much. They ate. Bram, halfway through his bowl, said without looking up, Pantry going to hold? Yes, she said. How sure? As sure as I am of anything, she said. The numbers say yes. I've been over them 3 times. He nodded and went back to eating. Cody looked at her from across the table with the expression he sometimes had, the one that was trying to understand something rather than just accept it. How bad is it going to get? He said. Bad enough that I'm glad we prepared, she said. Not so bad that we're in danger if we do things right. She looked around the table. Which means everyone sleeps in shifts. Nobody sleeps more than 4 hours without someone on the barn and the pipe checks. The lamps stay lit. Nobody goes out alone. You're not going out at all, Bram said. She looked at him. That's not... She started. You're not going out, he said again. Not unkind, just firm. You're the one who knows where everything is and what to do with it. You stay in. We go out. She held his gaze for a moment. Fine, she said, but I want a report every 2 hours. Every 2 hours, he said, and picked up his cornbread. The storm ran for 3 days. She lost track of time in the middle portion of it, not because she was confused, but because the rhythms of day and night flattened out under the continuous gray pressure of the snow and wind, and the only clock that mattered was the internal one of what needed doing next. The first day was controlled. Everyone knew their roles, the checks went on schedule, the pipe lamps held, the herd was steady. She kept the kitchen going continuously, soup, bread, coffee, because warm food was both practical and morale-maintaining. And on the first day of a storm, morale was still something you could influence. The second day was harder. The temperature dropped further overnight, and the wind changed direction slightly, which meant the lean-to on the bunkhouse south wall was no longer perfectly positioned, and some of the stacked firewood got more snow exposure than she'd planned for. It was still usable. She'd chosen split wood over round specifically because split wood shed moisture better. But it meant the men were bringing in wood that needed to dry near the stove for an hour before it burned well, which meant the fires in the bunkhouse ran lower for longer than they should have during the coldest hours. She adjusted. She moved the kitchen stove schedule to run continuously at a moderate heat rather than hot meals at set times, which kept the heat in the main house steady and gave the bunkhouse fire time to catch up. She had the men bring their coffee to the kitchen for refills rather than taking the pot to the bunkhouse, which got them inside the warmer space for 10 minutes at a stretch. Small adjustments. The kind that don't feel important until you realize that warmth is cumulative and its absence is too. On the second night, at the 2 a.m. lamp check, Garrett found one of the lamps had run low and flickered out. He caught it before the pipe fully froze. There was ice beginning at the joint but not through it. He refilled the lamp, held it close to the joint by hand for 15 minutes, and got the temperature back up. He told her about it at 3:30 when he came in for coffee. How close? She said. Close, he said. He held the mug with both hands. His hands were shaking slightly, not from cold, she thought, but from the particular tension release of a near miss. You did right, she said. Another hour and we'd have been hauling water, he said. But we're not, she said. He drank his coffee. She refilled it without being asked. The heifers? She said. All 9 a.m. check, he said, eating from the supplement, the one with the small teeth. She was the first one at the feed this morning. Something in her chest loosened slightly at that. She wrote it in the small notebook. Day 2, 3:30 a.m. Lamp low but caught. pipe joint close call, recovered. All 9 eating. That was the record. The record mattered because records were what you could show people afterward when they tried to tell you it couldn't be done. The third day the storm broke. Not dramatically. Not a sudden clearing, just a gradual lightening of the sky and a lessening of the wind pressure against the windows. And by afternoon there was a quality of silence to the yard that was different from the silence of snow falling. It was the silence of snow that had finished falling. Garrett and 2 of the hands went out and cleared the main paths. Bram went to the enclosure and came back with an expression that she read before he said anything. "All 9, he said, standing in the kitchen doorway. She didn't ask him to repeat it. "All 9, she said. He nodded. He looked tired, 3 days of interrupted sleep and hard, cold work. Tired, the real kind, and he also looked like something had settled in him. "The food held?" he said. "We used 62% of the storm reserve," she said, "which is about what I projected." He stood there for another moment. "Your ledger was right," he said. "The ledger's just numbers," she said. "You're the ones who went out in it." He made the huh sound. But this time it was different from all the other times he'd made it. Less skeptical. More like the sound of a man conceding something he'd been holding on to for a while. "The biscuits," he said. "Yes?" "Every morning," he said. "I'll tell you every morning if they're right or if they need something." She looked at him. "That's your way of saying you'll pay attention to the food quality and give me honest feedback," she said. "That's my way of saying the biscuits," he said. "All right," she said. "Every morning." He went back out to finish clearing the paths. She stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hand on the ledger and the morning light coming through the window at an angle that had been missing for 3 days. And she thought about the 9 heifers in the enclosure, all eating, and the pipe that hadn't frozen, and the 62%, and Bram's face in the doorway. Then she put water on for coffee and started on the biscuits. The day after the storm broke, the snow was still thigh-deep in the low places, and the road to the main gate was nothing but a white seam between the fence lines. Merritt stood on the porch in the early morning and looked at it and thought about all the ranches between Rookbar and Colton that had been less prepared than this one, and felt something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite worry, but sat somewhere between the two. The sky was clear for the first time in 3 days. Cold, hard blue, the kind of sky that looks beautiful and means the temperature is going to drop again tonight. She noted it and went back inside. The biscuits that morning were good. Bram told her so, which was the deal they'd made, and he said it without ceremony. Just stood at the counter with his coffee and said, "Biscuits are right today," and that was all. She nodded and kept working. Over the next 2 days, the ranch settled into the particular rhythm of a place that has survived something difficult and is now taking stock. Men moved differently. Not relaxed. The work was still hard, and the cold was still serious, but with a quality of steadiness that hadn't been there before the storm. They'd been tested and they'd held, and that knowledge was in them now, in the way they moved through the yard and handled the animals and sat at the table. Merritt updated the ledger every morning. Supply levels, animal status, firewood remaining. The 62% storm reserve usage she'd noted during the blizzard left them with 38% still in hand, which was, by her calculation, more than enough to carry through to the point when roads would reopen and resupply would be possible. She'd built the reserve with exactly this in mind, not just surviving the storm, but surviving what came after it, the slow, cold weeks when everyone assumed the worst was over and stopped paying attention. She didn't stop paying attention. Orrin Phelps arrived on the 4th day after the storm, and he did not arrive the way Merritt expected. She'd heard the name from Garrett, who'd mentioned him once or twice as a rancher with a spread about 4 miles north, a man who'd been running cattle in Frost Willow Basin for 20-some years and had opinions about most things. Garrett had said these opinions carefully, in the way men report on other men they have mixed feelings about. What she hadn't known until he appeared at the gate was that Orrin Phelps was also the man who, 3 months ago, at the Colton feed store, had been standing behind Garrett in the line and had said, just loud enough to carry, something to the effect that Elias Rook had apparently given a woman authority over his kitchen decisions, which showed how far things had fallen over at Rookbar. Garrett had told her about it a week later, apologetically. She'd said it was fine. It wasn't fine, but she'd said it was. So when Phelps came through the main gate on a horse that had been pushed through heavy snow and stood in the yard with his hat in his hand, she was watching from the kitchen window before Elias had even opened the front door. He was a large man, somewhere in his mid-60s, with a solid physical presence that had probably been imposing 20 years ago and was now just substantial. He had the look of someone who'd spent the storm in a worse situation than he'd anticipated and hadn't slept well since. She heard the conversation from the kitchen. Not every word, but enough. His water line had frozen completely on the first night of the storm. He'd caught it too late, spent the next 2 days hauling water by hand from a secondary source. He'd lost condition on 6 of his younger animals in the process. Not dead, but weakened. His hay supply had run lower than expected because he'd been feeding heavier to compensate for the stress of the water disruption. Now the storm was over and he was short on both hay and on any kind of practical knowledge for how to manage animals that had been through that kind of stress. He'd come to Rookbar, Merritt gathered, because Rookbar was the closest operation to his north boundary, and because he was a man who'd run out of other options and hadn't yet run out of pride entirely, which meant coming here had cost him something. Elias brought him to the kitchen. This surprised her. Elias had never brought anyone to the kitchen before. Business stayed in the main room. That was the unspoken arrangement. But he walked Phelps through the doorway and said, "Merritt, Orrin Phelps from the north boundary. He's got some questions about the water situation and the animals." Phelps looked at her. She could see him registering what this meant, that Elias had brought him to the cook, that the cook was apparently the person with the answers. His jaw moved. Not quite a clench. The processing of something uncomfortable. "Mr. Phelps," she said, "sit down. Tell me about the animals." He sat. He told her. She listened without interrupting, which she'd found was the fastest way to get the full picture from a man who was embarrassed about his situation. Let him get it out without stopping him, because every time you stopped a man like that, he spent 30 seconds recovering the momentum to keep going. When he was done, she asked 3 questions. How old were the affected animals? What had they been eating before the disruption? And how much water had they been getting daily during the hauling period compared to normal intake? He answered. She did arithmetic in her head. "They're probably not as compromised as they look," she said. "Cattle under stress lose condition faster than they actually lose health. The appearance gets worse before the underlying condition does, which is frightening, but it means there's more recovery window than you're probably assuming." Phelps looked at her, then at Elias. "What," she said. Elias confirmed. "How do I bring them back?" Phelps said. The question was directed at the table more than at either of them. A man asking a question he should know the answer to and doesn't. "Smaller, more frequent feedings for the next week," she said. "Not more food total. Same total, just divided into 3 times a day instead of 2. Their digestive systems have been under strain and you'll get better absorption with smaller loads. And you need to fix the water line before you do anything else, because a stressed animal that still doesn't have reliable water access isn't going to recover no matter what you feed it." "The line needs a full replacement," he said. "That section's been iffy for 2 winters. I kept meaning to do it." "I know the feeling," Elias said. Phelps looked up from the table. At Elias. There was something in the look that wasn't quite shame, but was adjacent to it. "Your operation held," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "It held," Elias said. "How?" Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I had someone paying attention." Phelps looked at Merritt. The full look this time, not the glancing assessment of before. The look of a man revising. She didn't make it easy for him, but she didn't make it hard either. "The supplement mix I've been using for the young cattle," she said. "I'll write it down for you. For the stressed animals, you'll want to adjust the ratio. Heavier on the bran, lighter on the molasses until they're eating consistently again." She pulled the small notebook from her apron pocket and began writing. "And for the water line, the lamp method I used here will hold it from refreezing while you arrange for the replacement. It's not elegant, but it's what I had." She tore out the page and slid it across the table to him. He looked at it, looked at her. "Why are you helping me?" he said. Not suspiciously, more like a man who genuinely needed to understand the answer. "Because your animals shouldn't suffer for a problem that can be fixed," she said. And because if your spread deteriorates, it affects the whole basin. That includes this ranch. He folded the paper carefully and put it in his coat pocket. Then he sat for another moment, the way a man sits when he's trying to decide whether to say something he didn't plan on saying. "The feed store," he said. 3 months ago. I said something. "I know," she said. "It was—" "You don't have to," she said. "I was wrong," he said. "That's what I was going to say." The kitchen was quiet. Merritt looked at the stove. "Yes," she said, "you were." And that was all she said about it. Phelps left with the supplement formula and the lamp instructions and the address of a man in Colton who did pipe work at reasonable rates. He also left with something she hadn't planned on giving him, 2 pounds of her bran reserve, portioned into a cloth sack, because he'd mentioned almost as an aside that he'd run through his own completely. She didn't tell Elias about the bran until later. When she did, he looked at the ledger. "Does that change our numbers?" he said. "It tightens the buffer by about 4 days," she said. "But we're far enough past the worst of it that I'm comfortable with that. We can resupply when the roads open." "You could have said no to him." "I could have," she said. "His animals needed it more than our buffer needed the margin." Elias nodded. He didn't argue. But word travels faster in a closed basin than it has any right to. Within a week of Phelps' visit, Merritt became aware, through the particular channels by which ranching communities exchange information. A hand mentioning something at the feed store, a wife saying something to another wife at the dry goods counter in town. That the story of Rookbar Ranch and its cook was circulating in Frost Willow Basin. Not all the details were accurate. The version she heard secondhand from Cody, who'd overheard it at the Colton livery, had her single-handedly rebuilding the stove during the blizzard, which wasn't true. The version Garrett mentioned, sourced from a man at the grain exchange, had the 9 heifers being literally starving when she arrived, which was an exaggeration. The version Bram heard, apparently, had her doing something mathematical that was not clearly described but was apparently impressive. She found this mildly irritating, the way inaccurate stories about real things are always mildly irritating, even when they're being told in your favor. What was accurate was the effect on the people who came. They started coming about 10 days after the storm. Not many, and not all at once. Frost Willow Basin wasn't dense enough with ranches for anything to feel like a crowd. But there was a steady trickle of people appearing at the Rookbar gate with some version of the same purpose that Orrin Phelps had come with. They'd had a harder storm than expected. Their preparations had fallen short somewhere, and they'd heard that someone at Rookbar had figured something out. She talked to all of them. A woman named Dora Settle, who ran a smaller operation with her brother 2 miles east, came about her milk cow that had stopped producing after the stress of the cold snap. Merritt talked her through the signs that distinguished temporary stress-related drop from actual illness, and wrote down a feeding adjustment that would help if it was the former. 2 brothers from the south end of the basin, whose names she never quite caught because they talked over each other constantly, came about a hay storage problem. Their supply had gotten moisture damage during the storm, and they wanted to know how much was salvageable. She told them the same thing she'd figured out about flour 8 weeks ago. You work through it methodically, you assess what you have versus what you think you have, and you don't throw out anything until you're certain it can't be saved. An older man, widowed and running his place with just 1 hired hand, came with a more general kind of lost look that she recognized as the look of someone who had been managing on stubbornness and was running low. She gave him coffee and an hour of practical conversation and the supplement formula and sent him home with a revised storage checklist she'd written out longhand. She was not a doctor. She was not a veterinarian. She was not an agricultural advisor or a professional of any formal credential. She told everyone who came exactly what she was and where the limits of her knowledge were, and she was careful to distinguish between what she knew for certain and what she was estimating. But she knew what she knew, and what she knew was more than most people in that basin had written down anywhere. The ledger was filling its second notebook by now. Stopped. Elias noticed the pattern about a week in when he came to the kitchen to find Dora Settle sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and what appeared to be a hand-drawn diagram of a cow's feed schedule. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "How many is that this week?" he said when Dora had gone. "3rd," Merritt said. She was already washing the cups. "Does it bother you? People coming for—" He searched for the right word. Advice, she said. No, it doesn't bother me. It takes time, but not more than I have. Some of these people weren't friendly to you, he said. Carefully. I know. Phelps wasn't friendly. The Settle woman wasn't exactly. They're friendly now, she said. Or at least they're here. That's good enough. He sat down at the table. She dried her hands and sat across from him. I need to talk to you about something, she said. His face shifted, the slight tightening of a man preparing for something he might not want to hear. Boss? She said. He relaxed slightly, which told her he'd been bracing for something else. What about him? He hasn't come back since the storm, she said. I've been thinking about why. Maybe Marsh told him what he saw and he decided the operation was in better shape than he thought. Maybe, she said. But I've been thinking about something else. You said he might know about the debt situation from people at the bank. I want to know more about that. Elias was quiet. Not because I'm going to do anything rash, she said. I just think we should understand what he has and what he doesn't have. If he knows the full loan amount, that's one situation. If he only knows there's a loan, that's different. How do you find that out? Does anyone at the bank owe you a straight answer about anything? He thought about this for a while. She could see him going through the names and relationships, the network of obligations and favors and old dealings that accumulated in a man's life the way the ledger accumulated entries. There's a man named Crane, he said finally. We've done business a long time. He's not involved in the loan directly, but he knows everyone there and He stopped. Honest? She said. More honest than most, he said. When he can be. When can you talk to him? Next time I'm in Colton, which is... Roads are opening up, probably another week. Can you write him a letter first? Get a sense of whether he'd be willing to have a direct conversation? Elias looked at her. You're thinking like a lawyer. I'm thinking like someone who wants to know what we're dealing with before it comes through the door again, she said. Voss shows up when he's ready. I'd like us to be ready first. He sat with this for a moment. All right, he said. I'll write Crane. Whoops. The letter went out with the first supply run to Colton, 12 days after the storm. By then the roads were passable, rough, with icy patches in the shaded sections, but passable. Garrett drove the wagon and came back with the hay resupply, salt, flour, and a reply from Crane, written in the small, dense handwriting of a man who was being careful about what he put on paper. Elias read it at the table while Merritt put away the resupply. She didn't ask. She finished with the flour, started on the salt, and waited. He's willing to talk, Elias said. He says, and he's being cautious, you can feel it in every sentence. He says the loan documentation has been reviewed recently by someone with an interest in the property. He paused. He doesn't name Voss. He doesn't have to, she said. He says the review was routine, but he says... Elias stopped. Read again. He says there are questions about whether the operational state of the ranch matches the loan security valuation. She came to the table. What does that mean? It means, Elias said slowly, that someone has suggested to the bank that the ranch might not be worth what it was assessed at when the loan was made, which would give the bank reason to reconsider the terms. She sat down. He's trying to change the collateral valuation, she said. That's what it sounds like. Can he do that? If the bank agrees the property has declined in value since the loan was made, yes. They can demand additional security or accelerate the payment timeline. She looked at the ledger on the counter, then back at Elias. The document I made, she said. The operational summary. Marsh took the only copy. Yes. Then we need to remake it, and we need to get it to the bank before Voss does whatever he's planning next. She was already standing up. And this time we need to add the storm performance data. The supply reserve that held, the animals that survived, the pipe situation, all of it. Elias looked at the letter in his hands. This is my fight, Merritt. You shouldn't have to... It became more than your fight when he walked in here and told me to leave the room, she said, not unkindly. Sit down. Tell me everything you can remember about the original loan assessment, what the property was valued at, what the assessor looked at, what condition things were in at the time. He sat down. It was 2 years ago, he said. Things were in rough shape. Rougher than now? Much rougher. Then we have something to work with, she said, and opened the ledger to a fresh page. The second document took 6 days, and it was better than the first. Not just more complete, though it was more complete, with the storm performance data added and the animal weights post-blizzard compared against the pre-storm numbers, showing net gains even accounting for the 3 days of difficult conditions. It was better because she understood more than she had the first time. She understood what Voss was doing and therefore what the document needed to counter. It wasn't just a record of current operations. It was a case for the ranch's trajectory, where it had been 2 years ago when the loan was made, where it was now, and the clear line between those 2 points. She asked Elias questions for 6 days. What had the barn looked like at the time of the original assessment? What was the condition of the water system? How many animals were on the property and in what health? What had the pantry inventory been? He answered honestly, which she appreciated because the honest answers were not flattering to the 2 years ago version of things, and he knew it. He sat across the table in the evenings and went back through his memory and his old papers and gave her what he could, and she turned it into something that told a true story rather than a convenient one. A true story could be verified. A convenient one couldn't. On the last evening, she read the completed document through twice and marked 3 places where she wanted to strengthen the language. Bram, who had taken to sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee in the evenings rather than going straight to the bunkhouse, a change nobody commented on, including Merritt, watched her mark the pages. "What's that for?" he said. She explained the situation with Voss and the loan valuation in 3 sentences. Bram's face did the complex reddening thing. "He's trying to steal the ranch," he said. "He's trying to use the bank to put Elias in a position where selling becomes easier than not selling," she said. "It's more complicated than stealing, but it comes to the same place." "What do you need?" She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "To fight it," he said. "What do you need?" "For the document to be delivered to Crane at the bank before Voss makes his next move," she said. "And for someone to go to Colton who knows how to talk to people there and can make sure it reaches the right hands." Bram set down his coffee. "I know everyone in Colton," he said. "Been going there for 11 years. "I know," she said. "I'll go tomorrow if the road holds." She looked at him for a moment. The man who'd told her she was wasting kitchen scraps on cattle. The man who'd said she had no business in financial conversations. The man who brought in wood exactly the way she'd shown him and checked the lamp at 2 in the morning without being asked, and whose opinion of her biscuits she'd somehow come to rely on. "Thank you, Bram," she said. "Don't make it a thing," he said, and picked up his coffee. Bram left for Colton the next morning and came back the day after. He'd delivered the document to Crane directly, in person, which was better than sending it by any other means because Crane had been able to ask questions on the spot, and Bram had been able to answer the questions he could and direct Crane to the document for the ones he couldn't. He brought back a handwritten note from Crane that was still being careful, but was warmer in tone than the first letter. Something had shifted in the man's view of the situation. He also brought back information that hadn't been in any letter. "Voss doesn't own property in Colton," Bram said, sitting at the kitchen table with the particular manner of a man debriefing after a mission he took seriously. "He operates out of there, but he rents. I talked to a man named Udell at the grain exchange. He's known Voss for about 4 years since he came into the basin. Voss has made offers on 3 other operations in that time. 2 of them sold." Merritt was very still. "What happened to those 2 ranches?" she said. "Udell doesn't know for certain. He thinks Voss broke them up, sold the land in sections, sold off the herds, but he wasn't sure." She looked at Elias, who had been listening from the doorway. "He's not trying to run a ranch," she said. "He's trying to acquire one." "To sell it," Elias said. The weight of this landed in his voice. "To sell it in pieces," she said, "which is worth more than the whole if you buy it under distress pricing." She looked at the ledger. "He needs the bank to put pressure on you. He needs you to feel like selling is your only option." "Can we stop him?" Elias said. "We already have, partially," she said. "The document changes what the bank sees when it looks at this place. Crane seemed to receive it well, from what Bram says. But we need one more thing." "What?" "We need to make the winter payment on time," she said, "before it's due, if possible. Early payment removes the leverage entirely. It tells the bank this operation is stable and Voss's suggestion that the collateral has declined doesn't hold. I said I could make the payment if nothing went wrong. Nothing went wrong, she said. The storm held, the animals held, the supplies held. Where are you? He was quiet for a moment. She saw him doing the arithmetic. Close, he said. How close? I'd need to sell something. The heifers, she said. He looked at her sharply. Not to Voss, she said. What's the market value if you sell 3 of the 9, the 3 that are fully recovered and in good condition, to a buyer in Colton at fair price? Right now, given what they weigh and what they'd fetch? Elias thought. Then he said the number. She looked at the loan payment figure she had written in the ledger. That's enough, she said. With your operating cash, it's enough. You want me to sell 3 heifers to make the bank payment early. I want you to sell 3 heifers at fair price, she said, to make the bank payment before Voss has time to make his next move. Yes. Elias sat with this. She could see him weighing it, the loss of 3 animals against the value of what the early payment would accomplish. Udell, Bram said. At the grain exchange. He mentioned he's been looking for young stock. Fair man, fair price. I'd trust him. Elias looked at Bram, then at Merritt. All right, he said. 3. But the sale was arranged by letter within the week. Udell came out himself to look at the animals. A compact, direct man who spent 20 minutes in the enclosure and said the price he was willing to pay, which was within $1 of what Merritt had calculated fair market value to be. She watched from the fence. Cody was standing next to her. He'd been doing the Monday weights for 3 months now, and he had an attachment to those animals that he probably didn't fully realize. 3, he said. 3, she agreed. 6 Stain. The one with the small teeth, he said. Stain, she said. He relaxed. The payment went to Colton with Garrett 2 days later. Early, clean, the full amount with a letter from Elias to Crane asking that it be applied immediately and a note requesting written confirmation of receipt. The confirmation came back within 4 days. She filed it in the ledger. Not a notebook page. Actual filing, folded and pressed flat against the inside back cover where it would stay. Then she looked at Elias. That's the first thing, she said. What's the second? We need to talk about the spring, she said. 6 heifers going into spring at their current trajectory. Those animals are going to be worth significantly more than what we sold the 3 for. And if we document that properly and keep the records the way we've been keeping them, the next time someone tries to tell the bank this ranch has declined in value, the bank is going to have a very different picture in front of it. Elias looked at her for a long moment. You're thinking past this, he said. I've been thinking past this since the second week I was here, she said. I just needed to get you through the winter first. He sat back in his chair. The pantry shelves, he said. She looked at him, not sure what he meant. When you first got here, he said, the first thing you fixed was getting the flour off the floor. You moved the pantry shelves up. The moisture was ruining the supplies, she said. But it was also the first sign, he said, that you were thinking forward, not about today's bread, about what the flour was going to look like in 6 weeks. She was quiet. I want you to stay, he said. Not just as, formally, a proper arrangement, not just cook's wages, something that reflects what you actually do here. She looked at the ledger, at the confirmation letter pressed into the back cover. The pantry shelves stay raised, she said. He almost smiled. They stay raised. And I want a proper budget for the supplement mix, she said, not repurposed kitchen leftovers. An actual line item. Done. And Cody keeps doing the Monday weights. He's good at it, and it matters to him. Fine. And you learn to read the ledger yourself, she said. I'll teach you. I don't want to be the only person who understands the numbers on this ranch. That's not good for the ranch. He nodded slowly. That's a lot of conditions. That's 3 conditions and a reasonable request, she said. He held out his hand across the table. She looked at it for a moment. Then she shook it. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the remaining snow was pulling back from the fence lines in the long, slow way of winter loosening its hold. And in the enclosure to the north of the barn, 6 young heifers were eating from the supplemented feed mix, including the one with the small teeth, who had, this past Monday, weighed in heavier than any of the others. Spring in frost. Willow Basin came reluctantly, the way it always did, not as a arrival, but as a slow argument between the cold and everything that wanted to grow, with the cold losing ground so gradually you almost missed the moment it actually lost. Merritt noticed it in the mud first, the frozen yard softening by degrees, the fence posts standing a little looser in the thawed ground, the particular smell of earth that had been locked under ice for months and was now breathing again. She noticed it in the animals second, the heifers moving differently in the enclosure, less hunched, ranging to the far corners instead of clustering near the barn wall for warmth. And she noticed it in the men, which was the clearest sign of all, because men who had been carrying the weight of a hard winter inside their shoulders for 3 months started to set it down in March, whether they meant to or not. She was teaching Elias the ledger. This was harder than she'd expected, not because he was slow. He wasn't. He was actually quicker with numbers than he'd let on, but because the ledger wasn't just numbers. It was a way of looking at things, a habit of attention that didn't come naturally to a man who had spent 20 years running a ranch by feel and memory, and the particular stubbornness that keeps people going in hard country. Numbers were one thing, but understanding what the numbers were telling you before the situation they described had already arrived. That was a different skill, and it took time. She sat with him 3 evenings a week at the kitchen table after supper. "The hay consumption rate for this week," she said one evening, pointing at the column. "What does it tell you about next week?" Elias studied the page. "We're running lower than the same week last year." "By how much?" "About 15%. "And what does that mean for the April resupply order?" He thought about it. "We could order 15% less. Or," he looked at the numbers again, then at the window, where the pasture was visible in the last of the evening light. "Or we order the same and build the buffer back up, since we ran it down in the storm." "Which one would you have done a year ago?" she said. "Ordered less," he said, "to save the cash." "And what does the ledger tell you about that decision?" He was quiet for a moment. "That the buffer is what got us through." "The buffer is always an expense until it's the thing that saves you," she said. "That's the part that's hard to keep in your head when you're looking at what it costs." He closed the ledger. Not in frustration, in the way a man closes something he's genuinely thinking about. "Your mother teach you this?" he said. The question landed quietly. She'd talked about her mother in pieces over the months. The ledger from her mother's household that she'd built on, the method of observation her mother had given her, the berries in the bottom of the bag. Not as stories, exactly. More as the way a person references the foundation of a house, not explaining it, just indicating where certain things came from. "She taught me to pay attention," Merritt said. "The numbers came from paying attention long enough to see patterns." "She was a practical woman." "She was," Merritt said. "Practical in the way that people get when they don't have the luxury of being impractical." She paused. "She also made the best dried berry preserves I've ever had, and she would have found my supplement formula for the heifers extremely funny." Elias looked at her. "Why funny?" "Because she always said the solution to most problems was already in the room," she said. "You just had to stop looking for something complicated and use what was there." She almost smiled. "Bran and molasses and leftover corn. She would have said she could have told me that." Elias was quiet for a moment. "She would have been right," he said. Voss came back in March. She'd known he would. Not because she had specific intelligence. Bram had been asking questions in Colton on the occasional supply run, and nothing definitive had come back. But she understood enough about how men like Voss operated to know that the storm hadn't ended his interest. It had only paused it. A man who had spent time researching an operation's debt structure and arranging for a bank assessment and making 2 formal visits did not simply change his mind because his first offer was refused. He came on a Wednesday, mid-morning, and this time he was alone. She noted the absence of Marsh before she noted anything else about him. No assessor meant he wasn't here to build a formal case, which meant this was something else. Elias received him in the main room. Merritt stayed in the kitchen, but she left the door between the rooms standing at its usual angle, which was open enough that she could hear clearly without it being obvious that she was listening. The conversation started normally enough, Voss asking about the winter, about the ranch condition, about the herd. His tone was different from the previous visits, not warmer exactly, more careful, like a man who had recalculated his position and was still figuring out the new approach. Then he said, "I heard you made the loan payment early." There was a brief silence. "I did," Elias said. "That's good," Voss said, and the way he said it, measured, not surprised, told her he'd already known. "Shows the operation is stable." "It is stable," Elias said. Another silence. "I want to make a different kind of offer," Voss said. "Not the heifers, something broader." Merritt set down what she was holding. "I've been looking at the basin," Voss said. "Not just Rookbar, the whole region. The ranches that held through the winter, the ones that didn't. There's an opportunity here in the consolidation of certain operations that could benefit everyone involved." He paused. "I'd like to discuss a partnership arrangement, not acquisition, partnership. A share structure where you retain operational control but gain access to capital that lets you expand the herd." She heard Elias shift in his chair. The particular sound of a man who was surprised by something and was being careful not to show it. "What kind of share structure?" Elias said. 40-60, Voss said. "You hold 60. I hold 40. I provide the capital investment. You run the operation." She was moving before she made the decision to move. She came through the doorway and stood at the edge of the main room. Voss looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not irritation this time, or not only that. More like a man resetting, because this person kept appearing in moments he hadn't calculated for. "This is a business conversation," he said, but the automatic quality of it was thinner than before. "It is?" she agreed. "And I have a business question." She looked at him directly. "The 2 ranches you've acquired in this basin in the past 4 years. Udell at the grain exchange mentioned them. What happened to those operations after you acquired them?" The room was very still. Voss looked at her for a long moment. "They were restructured." "Into what?" "Into more efficient operations." "Were they sold?" she said. "In sections or whole?" "A beat." "One was sold to a larger operation to the north. The other is still under management." "Whose management?" He looked at Elias rather than at her. "I don't think this is relevant to—" "It's relevant to whether a 40-60 partnership with you means Elias is still running this ranch in 3 years, she said, or whether it means he's been gradually bought out of his own land. The silence this time had a different quality. Not the silence of a room waiting for something to happen. The silence of something having already happened. Voss looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not dismissal. Not the curtain coming down. Something that was closer to the look of a man who has been playing a hand and has just realized the other person can see it. "You've been doing your homework," he said. "I've been paying attention," she said. "There's a difference." He was quiet. He looked at Elias. "I can put the terms in writing," he said. "A formal document. You could have it reviewed." "I'd like to know about the 2 ranches first," Elias said. His voice had the flatness she'd come to understand meant he'd made up his mind. "Before we discuss any document." Voss picked up his hat from the table. "I'll send you information about the acquisitions," he said. "Full disclosure. If you want to review it before we proceed, that's reasonable." He paused. "The offer is genuine, Elias. The basin is changing. The ranches that survive the next 10 years are going to be the ones that had capital behind them." "Maybe," Elias said. "I'll think about it." Voss left. Merritt stood in the main room after he'd gone and felt the particular tiredness that comes not from physical work, but from sustained alertness. The kind of tired that was in her jaw from paying attention to tone of voice rather than just words. "He's not done," she said. "No," Elias said. But he came in differently this time. "He came in with a new approach because the old approach didn't work," she said. "The partnership offer is more sophisticated than the straight acquisition. It's harder to refuse because it sounds like something you'd actually want." "Would I want it?" Elias said. Not defensively. An honest question. She thought about it honestly. "The capital would help," she said. "That part's true. But the share structure is the mechanism, and the mechanism is what matters. 40% is a significant position. It gives him rights to the financial records, to decisions above a certain value. potentially to bring in his own assessments of the operation. She paused. And if the operation hits a hard year, and hard years come, that's just ranching, a 40% partner with capital access is in a position to offer to buy out the other 60 for less than it's worth because the operator is under pressure. Elias was quiet. That's how the other 2 ranches went, he said. That's my guess, she said. I can't prove it. You don't have to prove it, he said. I've seen men operate this way before. I just didn't see it clearly until… He stopped. Until you had someone watching the numbers, she said. Until I had someone watching the numbers, he agreed. The information Voss sent about the 2 acquisitions arrived by post 10 days later. It was thorough. She'd give him that. Professionally assembled, clean language, the kind of document a man puts together when he knows it's going to be scrutinized. She and Elias read through it together at the kitchen table, and Bram sat at the other end with his coffee because he'd taken to being present for these conversations in the way a man takes on a role that nobody formally assigned him. The document described the 2 ranches in terms of operational challenges and capital needs. Both had been struggling with debt. Both had accepted the partnership arrangement. The language around what happened next was careful, restructured to optimize operational efficiency, asset disposition to align with long-term basin development strategy. But she'd been reading careful language for long enough to understand what it was covering. Both ranches no longer operated as independent entities. He sold them, Bram said. He'd been reading over their shoulders, which he did without apology. Dressed it up in language, but he sold them. After buying in as a partner at distressed prices, Merritt said, when the operations were under pressure. And making himself necessary in the process, Elias said. He was looking at one specific paragraph. Both operators said they couldn't have survived the hard year without his capital. They're quoted here saying that. Of course they are, she said. He needed them dependent. The partnership created the dependency. She sat back, looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was something she did when she was thinking and didn't need to pretend she wasn't. We're not doing this, Elias said. It wasn't a question. No, she said. How do we tell him in a way that ends it, he said. Because I don't want this man appearing at my gate every 6 weeks for the next 2 years. She thought about this. You write him a letter, she said. Formal, polite. You decline the partnership, and in the same letter you reference the bank payment receipt and the current operational documentation, and you mention, just mention, not threaten, that you've shared your assessment of his acquisition methods with Crane at the bank and with Udell at the grain exchange. She paused. Men like Voss operate on information asymmetry. They know more than you do, so they have the advantage. The moment you demonstrate that the asymmetry is closing, the calculation changes. You want to tell him we've been talking to people. I want to let him know that the people in this basin are talking to each other, she said, which is true. Phelps, the Settle woman, the brothers from the South End, they've all been here. They know what held at Rookbar over the winter, and they know why. She looked at him. Voss's model depends on isolated, pressured operations, ranches that don't compare notes. The more connected we are to the people around us, the harder it is for him to do what he does. Bram put down his coffee. I'll talk to Phelps, he said, and the others. Not about Voss specifically, just keeping the lines open. She looked at him. That would be useful, she said. I know people, he said. I've been here 11 years. I should have been talking to them more. A pause. Should have been doing a lot of things different. Nobody said anything to that. The letter to Voss went out the following week. Elias wrote it himself, which was important. It needed to be his voice, his decision, stated plainly. She helped him with the structure and the specific language around the operational documentation, but the letter was his. They didn't hear back directly. What they heard, through Bram and through Crane at the bank, was that Voss had shifted his attention to an operation on the far east side of the basin, a ranch with deeper debt problems, and no one in the kitchen keeping a ledger. She felt something about this that she didn't have a clean word for. Not satisfaction, something more complicated. The knowledge that the problem had moved rather than ended, and that somewhere on the east side of the basin, a ranch was probably not going to fare as well. She wrote it in the small notebook. East Side Operation. Find out who's running it. If they come here, be ready. She didn't know if they'd come. But she'd learned in the past year that being ready for the thing that might happen costs less than dealing with the thing that did. The 6 remaining heifers went into spring in better condition than anything Garrett had seen from young stock on this ranch in a decade. He said so on a Monday morning in April while he and Merritt stood at the enclosure fence watching them move through the fresh light. "The one with the small teeth," he said. She's the heaviest now." "By 4 pounds over second place," Merritt said. "Cody's very proud." Garrett almost smiled. He was a man of small expressions, but she'd learned to read them. "What are you going to do with them, the 6? "Fold them into the main breeding rotation," she said. "Elias and I have been talking about building the herd gradually over the next 3 years. Not fast. The infrastructure has to keep up with the herd size or you're just creating new problems. But the supplement formula has been consistent enough that I'm confident we can bring up the next group of young stock the same way." "You're staying," he said. "Not a question." "I'm staying," she said. He nodded, looked at the heifers. "When you first got here," he said, "I thought—" He stopped. "I know what you thought," she said. "I wasn't as bad as Bram," he said. "No," she agreed. "You were just quiet about it." He almost smiled again. "Fair." They stood for a while without talking, which was the kind of comfortable silence that takes months to build with a person. "The water pipe," he said. "I want to do the full replacement this month. Dig out the section and put in proper insulation before next winter." "I was going to bring that up," she said. "I know you were," he said. "I'm bringing it up first. Chab." Elias gave her the dried berries on a Thursday in late April. She was in the pantry when he appeared in the doorway, and he was holding a small cloth bag that she didn't recognize. Not her bag, a new one, sewn from what looked like a piece of the blue cotton she'd bought in Colton for mending. She could tell from the weight and the small shifting sound when he held it out that it contained something dry and small. She opened the bag. Dried service berries. Not many. Maybe 3 dozen, small and dark, smelling faintly of what they'd been before the drying. She stood very still. "Cody found the bush on the north slope," Elias said. "When he was up there checking the fence line last week. He didn't know what they were, so he brought some back and I looked it up." He paused. "You mentioned your mother's preserves once, and I remembered the pouch you keep at the bottom of your bag. I've seen you take it out and put it back a few times." She looked at the berries in her hand. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I did it." She thought about her mother, which she did every day, but usually in the quiet, peripheral way of a thought that didn't require your full attention. This required her full attention. Her mother had been a woman who worked with what she had and never apologized for the smallness of it, who kept accounts in a notebook and watched the smoke from the chimney and knew what the animals were telling her and died of a fever before Merritt was 25 in a hard winter that had been harder than anyone prepared for, who had pressed a small pouch of dried berries into her daughter's hand and said, "These are for when you have nothing else," and who had not meant food by it, exactly, had meant something harder to name. The knowledge that even in the worst of it, something small can be saved, something held, something carried forward to the other side. "They're not the same berries," she said. "No," he said, "but they're the same kind." She closed her fingers around the bag. There was a particular thing she'd understood over the past year, not gradually, but in specific moments that accumulated into a shape she could finally see clearly. The ledger was about numbers, yes. The supplement formula was about observation and adjustment. The document that Marsh had taken and the letter to Voss and the conversation with Crane at the bank, those were about strategy, about understanding the forces that operated on a place and finding the leverage points that kept them from winning. But underneath all of it, underneath every decision and every column of numbers and every small adjustment to every system, was something simpler and harder to explain. It was the thing her mother had given her without calling it anything, the belief that paying attention was not a passive act, that looking closely at what you had, understanding it honestly, treating it with care even when it seemed too small to matter, that was how you made things last. That was how you moved the flour sacks off the floor. That was how you fixed the damper. That was how 9 heifers that everyone wanted to write off became the foundation of a herd. People are always looking for the grand gesture. the dramatic turn, the moment where everything changes at once. And sometimes those moments exist. But in her experience, in the experience of a woman who had arrived hungry at a ranch gate with 11 cents and a broken bag strap and a notebook that still had her mother's handwriting in the front, what actually made things hold was the accumulation of small, careful, consistent decisions made by people who were paying attention when no one else was. The world does not run out of people who will dismiss what they can't immediately measure. Men like Voss are not rare. The assumption that a person doing quiet, practical work in an unromantic space is not doing anything that matters. That assumption is everywhere, and it will always be everywhere. You cannot defeat it by argument. You cannot shame it away. You can only do the work, keep the records, and be standing on the other side of the storm when everyone who was certain you didn't matter comes looking for what you knew. That was not a lesson she'd arrived at cleanly or quickly. It had come through the bad weeks, the nights when the wind against the window made her question every calculation, the mornings when Bram's skepticism sat like a stone in the room and she had to start the fire anyway. It had come through the moment she'd almost not said anything when Voss laid his contract on the table, almost just stepped back into the kitchen and let it happen. She was glad she'd put down the ledger instead. Chitu, on the last day of April, with the ground soft enough now to begin the pipe excavation and the pasture showing the first real green along the south-facing slope, Merritt went through the pantry one more time. She did this at the end of every month. Full inventory, everything checked and recorded, supply levels assessed against the coming month's projected needs. It was not a dramatic activity. It was methodical and quiet, and took about 40 minutes, and at the end of it, the ledger had a new page of numbers that nobody else in the ranch found interesting, except Elias, who had started coming to look at the new page when she finished. He appeared in the pantry doorway as she was closing the ledger. "Where are we?" he said. "Good," she said. "Better than last month. The winter reserves rebuilt faster than I projected because the supplement mix has the heifer's waste at a much lower rate. I've been redirecting what they don't use back into the general compost, which is improving the kitchen garden soil. When that garden produces in summer, it closes another part of the supply gap." He looked at her. "You're turning heifer supplement waste into garden soil into food supply," he said. "The problem and the solution are usually in the same system," she said. "You just have to look at the whole thing." He leaned against the door frame. He had the look he sometimes had now. Not surprised, but still slightly awed, which she found both touching and mildly unnecessary. "Bram took the Monday weights this week," he said. "Cody asked him to while he was sick. Bram did it, wrote the numbers down, put them in the notebook." She looked up from the ledger. "He wrote them down?" "In his handwriting, which is terrible," Elias said. "But he wrote them down." She was quiet for a moment. "The biscuits this morning," she said. "What did he say?" "He said they were right," Elias said. She nodded. "They were," she said. "I know." She kept the small bag of service berries on the shelf above the pantry door. Not in her canvas bag. That was where her mother's original pouch lived, and she wasn't ready to move that yet. Might never be. But on the shelf where she could see it when she worked. It wasn't a monument. It wasn't a symbol she'd constructed deliberately. It was just a small bag of dried berries on a shelf in a pantry, in a ranch in the mountains, in a basin that had come through a hard winter, and it was there because someone had noticed she might want it to be there. The ranch was not perfect. It would never be perfect. There would be bad years. She knew this in the way you know anything that is simply true about the world. There would be a year when the supplement formula needed adjusting because a new batch of brand came in with different properties. There would be a year when the weather was wrong in a direction she hadn't anticipated, and the numbers in the ledger would not tell her what to do, and she would have to work it out in real time. There would be conflicts with Bram, not the fundamental kind, not anymore, but the ordinary kind that happens between people with strong opinions who work in the same place for years. There would be the question of Voss, or the next man who operated the way Voss operated, arriving at the gate of some other ranch in the basin without anyone in the kitchen keeping a ledger. She was already thinking about that. She'd mentioned it to Orrin Phelps on his second visit, when he'd come with specific questions about spring feeding schedules. She'd mentioned it to Dora Settle in a letter she'd written in response to a question about the milk cow, which had fully recovered and was producing well. She'd mentioned it to the older widowed man, she'd learned his name was Halbert, who had come back in February with better questions than he'd had in January, which meant he'd been thinking in the months between visits. What she'd mentioned was simple. Write things down. Write down what you have, what you use, what you lose. Write down what the weather looks like when it changes in the ways that matter. Write down what works and what doesn't, and what the animals are doing when something is wrong. It doesn't have to be a ledger like hers. It doesn't have to be organized the way hers was. It just has to be written, because things that are written can be looked at again, and things that can be looked at again can be learned from, and things that can be learned from can be taught. That was the chain. That was the whole thing. Her mother had kept accounts for a laundry in another life, and from those accounts Merritt had learned to look at systems rather than moments. And from that habit she'd walked into a neglected kitchen and seen not a mess but a set of problems with solutions still attached. And from those solutions she'd kept 9 heifers alive through a blizzard and helped a man hold on to his land, and maybe, she was aware this was a large maybe, but she held it anyway, started something small that would move through this basin in the way useful knowledge moves, person to person, practical and unromantic and lasting. She closed the pantry and carried the ledger back to the kitchen. Bram was at the table with his coffee. Cody was washing a cup at the dry sink, recovered from his illness and moving with the energy of someone who'd been horizontal for a week and was glad to be upright. Garrett was outside. She could hear him talking to Fleck in the way he did when he thought no one could hear, low and even, the voice of a man and a horse with a long understanding. Elias was at the table with his own notebook, which he'd started keeping since March. It didn't look like her ledger. It was messier, less organized, with diagrams and crossed-out numbers and questions in the margins. But it was his, and it was there, and the information in it was real. She put water on for coffee. "Pipe crew comes Monday," Garrett called from the yard. "I know," she called back. "Waterline will be done by Wednesday if the ground stays soft." "Weather's holding," she said. "It'll stay soft." Bram looked up from his coffee. "How do you know?" She looked at him. "The smoke," she said. He looked toward the chimney. She watched him watch it, the way it rose straight and even in the still morning air, climbing without obstruction into the clear April sky. He nodded. "Rising," he said. "Rising," she confirmed. And it was.